Richard's early years.
Richard was one of 5 sons born to Henry II, King of England. He and the other members of his family had many wars between themselves as to who owned the land, and the slaves on that land. These wars caused the deaths of thousands of slaves, whether on the winning side or not. Whereas the only penalty for the king and his family if they were on the losing side was a fine. This fact should confirm to anyone that the king and his family members were creating wars between the slaves on their lands, just to make money from, or more specifically, taking the life force off of people for their own personal use. This is where folk stories of vampires sucking blood came from. Vampire stories were analogous to knights or warlords taking the life force, or as it is now called, taxes, from the peasants living near the castles. Anyway, I digress. Back to Richard's story. Richard joined with the King of France, and finally defeated his father. So the official story of the final battle between Richard and his father goes something like this. Henry and his army had been losing and were being chased by Richard and Philip of France. Henry was in the clear though, as he was sure to reach Normandy and relative safety before they could catch him. But Henry became unwell, to the point he knew he was dying, and against his advisors' wishes, turned the army round and headed back towards the opposing army. Now you would think it was to have one last battle, for death or glory. But no, he had a chat with his son and Philip, and they agreed to stop the fighting, keep the land divvy as is, and Richard would be the new king, which was nice. And they all went to bed happy that night. Again, anyone with common sense can see, because Henry II knew he was dying, he brought the current money-making war to an amicable end before he died, making sure the false war would not be taken up by someone who did not know it was a money-making scam. After all, he did not want someone to avenge his death by killing his son.
Richard's coronation.
During the coronation of Richard at Westminster Abbey, tradition barred all Jews and women from the investiture. Some Jews did turn up, offering gifts, but were thrown out and flogged by Richard's courtiers. Then a rumor was spread that Richard had said that all Jews should be killed and the citizens dutifully obliged. As in all cases where extreme evil is committed on behalf of the king or queen, it is always a rumor or a misunderstanding as to the thing needed to be destroyed by the monarch is destroyed, and the monarch, it is said, never wanted such evil to happen.
Richard and the Third Crusade.
Shortly after his coronation, Richard made plans to go on the Third Crusade to relieve Jerusalem from Saladin. So he began raising funds by raising taxes and raiding his father's treasury. He even said, "I would have sold London if I could find a buyer." On the way to the Holy Land, Richard occupied Sicily and did a bit of looting, wheeling and dealing. He then accidentally ended up on Cyprus, and it turned out the incumbent overlords were very naughty, so Richard relieved them of the island, making a vast fortune in doing so, and then later, making a tidy profit from selling Cyprus to the Knights Templar, which was nice. Before leaving Cyprus to continue his crusade, he married Berengaria, thus acquiring the Kingdom of Navarre and more land. Is it me, or is there a pattern emerging on this crusade?
You will be defeated!
Richard reaches Acre.
Richard landed at Acre, and even though unwell, joined the other crusaders in attacking the city. He was so unwell, he had to fight by firing his crossbow from his chaise longue, which was carried by his men, I kid ye not. Anyway, this is the point where Richard had an argument with Leopold over a flag and caused Leopold to return to Austria in a huff, and at the same time Philip of France returned home, but Richard stayed, even though he and Philip had agreed to go on the crusade together, because neither trusted the other, not to take the other's land, while the other one was away, doing God's work. But Richard at this point must have forgot about that. That's the official version of events at Acre. Now I would say this is the point where Richard and Leopold conspired in the collection of a king's ransom, by giving the impression Richard had been captured by the man he had had a kerfuffle with over a flag. Anyway, we will come back to that later. So after cold-bloodedly killing 2,700 Muslim prisoners, Richard moved south, winning battles on the way towards Jerusalem, getting within 12 miles of the town, but then, for some dubious reasons, decided to retreat back to the coast and start unsuccessful negotiations with Saladin. While waiting for who knows what, they had an election to decide who should be king of Jerusalem even though they did not own Jerusalem. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the man elected was assassinated and Richard's nephew married the assassinated King to-be's widow. Moving on, the Crusaders made another attempt to capture Jerusalem and got within sight of the city but started arguing about, should they really be attacking Egypt, which caused them to all march back to the coast. Maybe they should have had that argument before they sallied forth? Again, as in all world leaders' endeavors, things happen beyond their control that stops them achieving the goals of their religion, country, or state, but they through no fault of their own, acquire vast swaths of land and personal wealth. This after a few more battles brought the Third Crusade to an end and Richard and Saladin became good friends and admirers of each other and even did a deal to allow Christian pilgrims and merchants access to Jerusalem. So did it really matter that Jerusalem was not a Christian town? I'm sure it did not matter to Richard, as he now set off, back to Britain and wealth, beyond his wildest dreams.
The journey home.
Richard, knowing the safest and fastest way home was by sea through the Mediterranean and out through the Gibraltar Straits, and then north to Britain, making sure he did not go anywhere near Austria and the evil Leopold. But he was blown off course and had to land in Corfu. Having enemies in Corfu, Richard then inexplicably sailed north, in the direction of Austria, and was shipwrecked near Aquileia. Strangely, he was captured in Vienna, while en route to his brother-in-law in Bavaria, having had to travel through Austria, missing many possible turns to Bavaria to get to Vienna. Now call me silly, but if you had an enemy in a country you could avoid, wouldn't you avoid it? But not Richard. He seemed to be making a beeline for Austria. Anyway, Richard was captured by Leopold, who was excommunicated by Pope Celestine III because to capture a crusader was contrary to public law. Leopold then handed Richard to Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, who then imprisoned him in Trifles Castle. Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, needed money to regain southern Italy, and by sheer luck the Pope did not excommunicate Henry VI as he had Leopold, so the ransom was asked for. The amount requested was the same amount that had been raised from England to pay for the Crusades, or what was known as the Saladin tithe, only a few years before, £100,000 of silver. There were stories that Philip of France and John, Richard's brother, had offered money to Henry VI to keep Richard a prisoner for longer, but Henry had refused. These stories would have been put about by the mainstream media of the time. So the English people, thinking the king was in trouble, were put upon to pay for his release. The money was collected and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. And Richard raced back to England to fight John and Philip to regain the land lost to the British people. Anyway, once back, Richard forgave John and named him as his heir in place of their nephew, Arthur. Which was nice. Richard went back to fighting Philip, and had many battles, destroying many towns. And some say one town because it was said one of the townsfolk had found a Roman treasure trove. I can't imagine that to be true, as the Lionheart was a goodly knight who only fought for God and country.
The end of Richard the Lionheart.
Richard was shot in the shoulder with a crossbow bolt by a child who had had his father and two brothers killed by Richard. The boy standing in front of Richard explained this, knowing Richard was going to die, and with that knowledge he was going to be executed, but Richard, being Richard, in a final act of mercy forgave the boy, and said,
"Live on, and by my bounty behold the light of day."
Then released him with a gift of 100 shillings to boot. What a guy. Richard died, but his last act of chivalry regarding the boy who had killed him was in vain, when a mercenary, as soon as Richard died, flayed the boy alive and hanged him. It's another one of those cases where evil is done for the king or queen, but not by or with orders from the king or queen. It's the bloody people who work for the king or queen that do evil. Now, as I have re-looked into the story of Richard the Lionheart, I knew it was a story of conspiracy, evil and greed, but it still manages to stagger me in its outright criminality and corruption of the people in power, and I hope you see what I see, bearing in mind history is written by the winners. Read between the lines. If you study history, don't just accept statements that seem out of context or unnecessary, because they are the clues to the truth.
Somewhere in my head I'm still a white knight, flying across the plains into my last fight. Somewhere in my head I'm still a hero, work my way back up from pretty much nothing. This is not that game with the bowling pins. We used to just fight for our lives. And if you die young and are born again, please tell someone why.